The day I finally understood what I had inherited, I was already too late to use it for what I wanted most. I was standing in front of the man I had loved for 3 years. And my eyes, the eyes that had shown me every hidden truth in every room I had walked through for the past week, refused to show me his face. Not the mask, not the performance, his face, the real one underneath all the others. I had used this gift to free my brother from a death sentence. I had used it to name a conspirator in open court, before the king, before the council, before everyone who mattered. I had spoken truths I could not unspeak. Burned bridges so thoroughly that the ash was still falling when I finally reached for Dorian's hand. And the gift that Medusa had passed down through my bloodline like a debt I never agreed to carry, went silent. By then, the king was already dead. My brother was already free. And Medusa was standing at the edge of the courtyard, watching me the way someone watches a person repeat an old mistake they have no power to correct. She had lived this moment. She had seen this exact shape of grief from the inside. She had never warned me, because there are things even Medusa cannot see. And the blindness that costs the most is always the one you carry for love. This is what she remembered. This is what she could never forget. If this story pulled you in, like the video and follow Medusa's Memories, tell us, what state are you listening from? The kingdom of Ashanmir had a law that everyone knew and no one said aloud. The truth belonged to the king, not as metaphor, not as philosophy, as actual, enforceable, carved-in-stone law. There was an edict, the Edict of Clarity. 3 centuries old, embedded in the foundation stones of the courthouse at the center of the city. Everyone walked over it every morning without looking down. Which was, I had always thought, the most honest thing about Ashanmir. Its truths were buried under the feet of people too busy surviving to examine what they were standing on. The edict stated that no testimony given in the royal court could contradict the official record without written corroboration from 2 witnesses of recognized standing. In practice, this meant that if the king's archivists wrote something down, it was true. If the king's archivists wrote something different, the previous truth ceased to exist. If you had lived something that no archivist had recorded, you had not, legally speaking, lived it at all. My mother had been one of those archivists for 19 years. She had written many things down. She had also hidden something in a place no archivist would ever look. Inside the loose spine of a book of children's songs on the bottom shelf of our house, behind the good boots we only wore 2 funerals. I did not know it was there when the soldiers came for kale. I was in the kitchen when they arrived, grinding spices I had no particular use for, because my hands needed to be busy when my mind was moving fast, and my mind had been moving very fast for 4 days, ever since the night. Kale had come home late with ink on his collar that was not his own color of ink, and said nothing about it, and ate his supper too quickly, and went to bed before the fire had died. Kale never went to bed before the fire died. He was the kind of person who sat with things until they were finished, who waited for the last warmth before he let the night in. The break in that pattern had lodged itself in my chest like a splinter I couldn't locate. And the grinding was my way of working it loose. There were 4 soldiers, 3 more than necessary for one young man who had never thrown a punch in his life. The captain had a face made of compressed certainty, not cruel, but emptied of hesitation, the way a tool is empty of doubt about its purpose. He read the accusation in the flat tone of someone reciting something he had memorized in order to not think about it. Theft of the royal seal, unauthorized duplication, intent to falsify official documents. His voice had the texture of administrative procedure. My brother's life, translated into that texture, became something almost unrecognizable. The penalty was death. Kale looked at me over the captain's shoulder while the charges were still being read. His face was very still the way water is still right before something breaks the surface, and underneath the stillness I could read everything we had built, our communication on across 22 years of being the only family left to each other. I am terrified. I am not surprised. Do not let them see you react. He had known this was coming. He had known and said nothing because he had wanted to protect me from whatever knowledge would have made it my problem too. They took him before I could ask him anything. The captain left a courtesy summons. A character witness could appear within 3 days if she chose. If she chose. As if choosing had anything to do with it. As if I would not have walked through fire and recitation and every legal impossibility. Ashenmir's archival bureaucracy could construct between me and my brother's life. I stood in the kitchen after the door closed. The spices smelled like something specific I couldn't name. Outside, the birds were still singing, which seemed wrong in a way I didn't have the vocabulary for. Then I went to the bottom shelf. I don't know what pulled me there. The book of children's songs was not something I had thought about in years. My mother had read it to us when we were small, before the archive consumed her evenings, before the cough came, before everything. I had not opened it since her funeral. But I moved toward it the way you move toward something your body knows before your mind catches up. And when I pulled it from the shelf and felt the stiffness in the spine, I knew immediately that it was not the stiffness of age. It was the stiffness of something carefully inserted and re-glued by hands that were patient and precise and accustomed to concealment. The scroll was sealed with my mother's personal stamp, the small flower press she had used for private letters, never for archive work. I held it for a long time without opening it. There was a rule in our house: you do not open things not addressed to you. This one was addressed to no one specific, which was another way of saying it was addressed to whoever had to open it. Which was me, which was a person my mother had hoped would never exist, the child who outlived her. Alone, needing what she'd hidden, I put it in my pocket and went out. I needed to understand what a character witness could actually accomplish in a court that had already processed an accusation. I needed to find someone who moved in the circuits I had always skirted. The court scribes, the minor functionaries, the people who knew how the machinery worked without being important enough to have designed it. Those people gathered in the coffee houses of the archive district in the gap between morning duties and afternoon session. And I had walked past those coffee houses hundreds of times without going in, because they were not my world, and I had been raised to be precise about the boundaries of my world. I went in. The archive district in full morning light had a particular quality of noise, the productive hum of a machine that believed in its own importance. The shuffle and crosstalk of people who dealt in information and therefore treated all information, including casual conversation, as potentially significant. The coffee houses were warm and smelled of roasted grain and ink and the slightly sour edge of ambition. I stood at the door of the largest one and looked through the glass at the tables, looking for a face I recognized. I found one I had not expected. Dorian was sitting near the window with 2 other men in court administrative blue. He was laughing the easy, unreserved laugh of someone who had never had to calculate whether laughter was politically safe. I had watched him from the margins of public spaces for 3 years, since he had helped me carry a stack of my mother's documents on the courthouse steps when I was 14, when my arms were giving out and my pride was giving out faster. He had not made anything of it. He had carried half the stack, said good luck with the rest, and walked away without looking back. I had spent 3 years thinking about how that felt, the ease of it, the lack of performance, the help given without the expectation of a debt. When I opened the door, he looked up immediately. His face did something very small and specific. Not quite a smile, but the preparation for one. The way a room prepares for light before the curtain is opened. "Lyra," he said, "I heard about your brother." And then the light changed. Not the light in the room. The light behind my eyes. Something that had been filtered all my life was suddenly, without warning, unfiltered, as though a lens I hadn't known was there had been removed. And the world I had been seeing was a version, a translation, a careful reduction of something much more layered. The room did not look different. It felt different. I could see the 2 clerks at Dorian's table, their practiced indifference. And beneath the indifference, I could see that one of them was frightened about money in a specific, chronic way, and the other was nursing an anger about something recent and deliberate, something done to him that he was not yet ready to act on. I could see the coffeehouse owner moving between tables. And beneath her efficient hospitality, I could see a grief so old it had become architectural. Built into the set of her shoulders, the careful way she moved around the tables, she had stopped really seeing. I could see Dorian, his warmth real, his carefulness also real. And beneath both of those, something else. Something wrapped and sealed in a way I had never encountered. My new sight moved toward it the way sight naturally moved toward the thing in the room that does not quite fit. And then it did something I had no reference for. It slid away. Not blocked exactly, redirected like trying to look at the sun directly. Not pain, but the refusal of the eye to hold the source. I did not understand what that meant. I filed it in the same place I had filed the ink on Kale's collar and the too quick supper and the too early bed. The category of things I was not yet ready to look at. I need help, I said. I need someone who understands how character testimony actually functions in the king's court. What it can do, what it can't. He pulled out the chair across from him. Sit down, let me tell you what I know. He knew a great deal. He spoke clearly and without condescension, which was rarer than it should have been in a city where information was currency and withholding it was habit. He explained the weight structure of witness testimony. The corroboration requirements. The way a character witnessed without standing was mathematically insufficient against an official record, but also the exceptions, the edge cases, the moments in Ashenmere's legal history when a sufficiently specific and substantiated public testimony had created enough political pressure to force a review. It had happened twice in the past century. Both times, the witness had arrived not just with character, but with evidence. Something concrete enough to make the record the court had to choose to defend it. So it's not impossible, I said. Nothing is impossible in Ashenmere, he said. It's just very specifically expensive. The whole time he talked, I watched the room with the new sight, cataloging what it showed me with the methodical habit my mother had drilled into me from childhood. Observe, record, do not yet interpret. The coffeehouse owner's grief was connected to a child, a photograph on the wall behind the counter. Boy of about 10 that she touched when she passed it without looking at it directly. The frightened clerk's money trouble was recent and specific. Connected to a debt he owed someone in this very building, someone he could see from where he was sitting. The angry clerk's anger was connected to a document, a promotion record, a denial, something formal and official and wrong. Everyone in the room was carrying something the room was pretending not to see. The sight was showing me all of it, and it was showing me without judgment, without horror, without the emotional charge I might have expected. It was simply information. The kind of information the world withholds when it decides you are not the kind of person it needs to inform. I had been that kind of person my whole life. Invisible by default, not by choice. The daughter of an archivist, the sister of a too gentle young man, the girl who carried stacks of documents up courthouse steps and had no standing and no leverage and no particular reason to be noticed. The sight had noticed me instead, or rather, it had chosen me. Why me? That question had not surfaced yet, not fully. But its shape was already present in the room like a sound not yet made. I could feel it the way you feel, the silence before a word that will change something. I thanked Dorian. He said he hoped it helped. He said, with a casualness that somehow did not feel casual at all, that if there was anything else he could do, he would want to. The warmth in his voice was completely real. The something sealed beneath it said nothing and gave nothing away. I walked home through the archive district, through the long afternoon shadows of buildings full of documents that constituted the official version of everything. And I thought about what my mother had known and what she had chosen to do about it, and what the difference was between those two things. I thought about the scroll in my pocket, I sat with the fire that night until the last of it was gone, the scroll still unopened in my hands because I was not yet ready for the world to change again. The sight settled around me like something that had always been there. Something that had simply been waiting for the right pair of eyes to come home to it. I could feel it moving even in the dark, the house breathing its histories around me, the walls with their absorbed decades of small human truths. My mother's ghost, not supernatural, just structural, the places she had touched the most, worn smooth with the repetition of her particular life, before I finally slept. Sitting upright in her chair, because her chair was the one place in the house that still felt like she might walk back into it. I felt something at the edge of the room, not a presence exactly, a quality of attention. The specific sensation of being seen by something that saw very well. I opened my eyes, she was not in the room. The room was empty, but the sensation remained for another moment. Precise and cool and very old, the unmistakable feeling of being watched by something that had been watching for a very long time, something that had been waiting patiently. Across years and lineages, and the slow turning of a bloodline toward the moment it was needed. Medusa, I thought, without knowing why I thought it, without knowing yet what that meant for me. I did not sleep. Dawn came anyway, the way it always does, indifferent to whether you are ready. 3 days until the new moon. 3 days until the king's preferred hour for executions. My brother was in a cell with stone walls and inadequate light, and I had a scroll I hadn't opened, and a sight I didn't understand and a memory of. Warmth in a man's voice that sat beneath the surface of something I couldn't look at directly. I got up, I went to the archive. The Royal Archive was the largest building in Ashenmere that no one thought of as a building. It was more like a climate, the official atmosphere of the city, the place where the city's idea of itself was stored and maintained and periodically revised. The rooms smelled of treated paper and cedar oil, and the particular dust of things kept very deliberately from decay. The light came through windows so high they served more as ventilation than illumination, which meant the archive workers spent their days in a kind of respectful dimness, moving through the stacks with the particular precision of people who had learned to read in the dark. My mother had moved through these stacks for 19 years. I had spent a significant portion of my childhood in the corridors outside, waiting for her shift to end, doing my schoolwork on the bench outside the public reading room. Learning the particular vocabulary of an institution that processed reality into record and called the result truth. I knew which clerk to ask for access to the historical cross-reference section. I knew which form to fill out. I knew that the forms were theoretically mandatory and practically optional for anyone who had once worked here, whose face the older clerks still recognized, whose mother had spent 2 decades memorizing the filing logic of 300 years of Ashenmere's official self-image. I did not know that I was being watched from the moment I walked through the door. I felt it before I understood it. The new site registering something in the building's ambient information that the rest of me had not yet caught up to. A weight of attention, directed and deliberate, not hostile yet, evaluative. The sensation of being observed by someone who had not yet decided what to do about what they were observing. I found the section I needed, tax records from 7 years ago, the period my mother's scroll had described. I sat at one of the research tables with the formal request documents spread in front of me as cover and the scroll finally unrolled in my lap, reading it again in better light. My mother's handwriting, small and very steady. The archival style, stripped of emotion, applied to something that must have cost her everything to record without emotion. The senior archivist appointed in the 16th year of King Aldric's reign had, on instruction from the king's counselor, authorized a duplicate of the royal seal and used it to stamp a revenue allocation document that redirected tax receipts from 3 border provinces, Varn, Geld, and the narrow river province of Eskau, into a private account registered under a name that did not correspond to any official person in the archive. The original allocation document had been filed in the restricted historical section, which meant it could only be accessed by senior archivists and altered or buried by the same. The redirected funds had totaled over the following 2 years, an amount equivalent to approximately 1/3 of the annual military budget. The counselor's name was Vane Aldous Vane, who had served under 4 kings, who was currently standing in the doorway of the research section, watching me with the particular stillness of a man who had spent a lifetime learning to read the shape of a situation from across a room before anyone else knew there was a situation to read. I understood, in the same moment I looked up and saw him, that the sight had already known he was there, that it had been trying to tell me for the past several minutes the way an unfamiliar sense takes time to find words for what it's showing you. I looked at him the way I had learned in less than 24 hours. To look at people with the new sight, past the surface performance, past the layer of deliberate presentation, into the structure underneath. What I saw was very cold, not cruel. Cruelty requires some engagement with the humanity of others, some acknowledgement that they feel things. What I saw in Aldous Vane was the complete absence of that acknowledgement, not malice. Architecture, he had built himself into a structure that processed people as variables, and he had done it so thoroughly and so long ago that there was no version of him remaining that remembered what it felt like to have been otherwise. And beneath that architecture, at the very bottom of what the sight could reach in a single look, fear, old, permanent, structural fear, the kind that has been load-bearing for so long, it has become indistinguishable from conviction. He was afraid of being seen. He had been afraid of it for decades, and he had just watched me unroll a document in a restricted section that should have been inaccessible to me, and his face was very calm, and his hands were very still, and the fear under the architecture was screaming. "Miss Lyra," he said, "I was sorry to hear about your brother." "Were you?" I said. This was the first time it happened, the compulsion. Not a voice, not a command, nothing that felt imposed. Simply the absolute impossibility of saying anything else. The truth I could see in front of me had the specific, physical weight of something that needed to exist outside my body, that needed to be spoken in order to be real, and the idea of wrapping it in social courtesy and leaving it unspoken felt like trying to hold water in cupped hands. Not a moral failure, just an anatomical impossibility. He was not sorry. He had orchestrated this. He had seen my mother's name in the archive records for years. Knowing she knew, calculating that a woman with 2 young children and no standing had made the correct decision to know and say nothing. He had waited for her to die. And then, when Cale had stumbled into something, I still did not yet know exactly what Vane had calculated again. Quickly and correctly. That an accusation against the archivist's son was the most efficient way to clean up a loose end that had almost certainly found the document. "Cale didn't steal the seal," I said. "Someone used him to access the courier records so the original duplicate authorization could be located and destroyed before anyone asked questions. He was a door left open for 5 minutes. You're trying to execute a door." The silence that followed this had a texture, not the silence of shock. Vane was not the kind of man who showed shock, had possibly not felt it in decades. The silence of recalibration. The precise, nearly soundless sound of a very intelligent person rapidly reassessing what kind of problem they were looking at. "That," he said carefully, "is a remarkable interpretation of events." "You already know it's not an interpretation," I said. "You know exactly what it is. The question you're asking yourself right now is whether I have the corroboration to make it matter in court, or whether I'm just a girl with a dead mother's scroll and no standing and no way to make the record move." Another silence. I watched his face with the sight, watched the fear in the architecture spike, and then, very deliberately, be suppressed. He was recalculating, running numbers I couldn't see, political numbers, risk numbers, the calculus of what I could actually do versus what I was claiming I could do. "Your brother's trial is in 2 days," he said. I hope, for your sake and his, that you find whatever it is you're looking for." He left. I sat with my hands very still on the table, the scroll under them, and I understood two things simultaneously. First, that I had just told him exactly what I knew and exactly how limited my leverage was, which was tactically catastrophic, and second, that I had had no choice. The compulsion had spoken before the tactics could decide, gave you truth without the option to withhold it. It was not a weapon you aimed, it was a pressure that found its own release. This was the thing my mother could not have warned me about because she had not known. The sight had not been hers. She had simply carried it without knowing through the ordinary architecture of her blood, waiting for the generation that would actually wake it up. The question that had been forming since the coffee house sharpened into something I could almost hold. Why me? Why now? Why a 17-year-old girl with a dead mother and a brother in a cell and no standing and no leverage and a gift she didn't know how to control? I opened the cross-reference file I had requested. I began to look for the corroboration my mother's scroll needed. A second document, a fiscal record, a transfer authorization from the right period, something that existed in the official record and could be set beside the hidden scroll and made undeniable. I worked through the afternoon. The light through the high windows moved with the patience of something that had watched many people sit in this room and not find what they were looking for. I found it at the third hour past noon in a subsection of the Border Revenue Records from 7 years ago. A reconciliation document that showed a discrepancy between the recorded allocation and the actual disbursement to Varan province, annotated in a clerk's hand. Not the senior archivist's, not Vane's, but a junior clerk who had done the arithmetic and noticed it didn't add up and written a question mark in the margin because that was what you were supposed to do when the numbers didn't match. The question mark had never been answered. The annotation had never been actioned. It was a crack in the official record, tiny, ignored, still there. 2 witnesses of recognized standing. The edict required to had my mother's scroll, which was 1 witness. I needed a second, a living one, someone who had seen something and could be compelled to say so in court. Someone who standing the court would have to acknowledge. I thought about the junior clerk who had written the question mark in the margin. I looked at the date. 7 years ago, that clerk would have been new. A 7-year record of employment in the Royal Archive constituted recognized standing under the Edict of Clarity. If that person was still employed here, if they still remembered, if they could be found and asked, I spent an hour tracking the employment records. The clerk's initial was El Heron. I found the current employment register. El Heron, Archive Section 3, present-day assignment. I went to Section 3. She was a woman about my mother's age, with ink-stained fingers and the specific look of someone who had been keeping their head down for a long time and had become very good at it. She looked at me when I found her at her station with the expression of someone who had hoped, at some point in the recent past, that this would not happen. "You found the cross-reference," she said. She did not make it a question. "Yes," I said. "I wondered," she said, "over the years, whether someone would..." She looked at her hands. I wondered what I would say when they did. With the sight, I could see that she had been wondering for 7 years. That the wondering had a very specific shape, not guilt, exactly, but the weight of a thing left undone, that was also the weight of everything she had managed to keep by leaving it undone. 2 children, a husband who had been ill for most of those years. A modest but stable life that had continued to be stable because she had written a question mark in a margin and then never asked the question aloud. "You don't have to say anything now," I said. "I'll ask you to say it in court the day after tomorrow, before the new moon. I need you to say in front of the king that you noticed the discrepancy and it was never addressed. That's all, just that you noticed." She looked at me for a long time. With the sight, I could see the calculation happening. The exact same calculation my mother had made 19 years ago, and every year afterward, the weighing of stability against the unbearable weight of complicity. "Your mother," she said finally, "Sira. She was the one who found the original document." "Yes," She never said anything. No, she had children. Yes. She looked at her hands again. Outside the high windows, the afternoon had turned golden and long. Somewhere in the city, in a cell with inadequate light, my brother was sitting with whatever knowledge he carried about how he had become a door left open at the wrong moment. "The day after tomorrow," the woman said. "Before the new moon, yes. If I don't come," she said, not looking at me, "I want you to know that I thought about it." "I'll know," I said. I meant it. With the sight, I already knew she would come. The thing I could see in her, beneath the 7 years of careful survival, beneath the question mark never spoken aloud, was something that had been waiting for exactly this specific kind of asking. The kind that came without leverage, without threat, without the demand that she put her stability on the line for an abstract principle. Just the day after tomorrow, before the new moon, just that you noticed. I walked home in the long evening light. I had corroboration. I had a plan. I had a sight I could not control and a compulsion I could not predict, and a day and a half until everything would either work or shatter. I had not yet opened the rest of what the scroll contained. When I got home, I read it again, more carefully. And at the bottom of my mother's small, steady handwriting, below the details of the revenue fraud, below the careful documentation of what she had seen and when and how, there was a paragraph I had somehow skimmed past the first 2 times. It was about me, not by name. She had not known I would be the one to find it. But she had written, "If this reaches any of my children, know that what you carry is not only from me. The sight that runs in this blood is older than our family. It comes from a woman who stood in front of the immortal queen and did not look away. Not because she was brave or foolish, but because she recognized something. She knew that the queen was not a monster. She was something that had been made into one balance, and the queen, who had not been recognized in a very long time, recognized being recognized. She gave the woman who saw her clearly the only gift she had that wasn't made of stone, the ability to see clearly in return. That woman was your great-great-grandmother. And you, whatever your name is, reading this in whatever future you inhabit, you carry that clarity. Be careful with it. It costs more than you know." I sat with that for a long time. The sight that lived behind my eyes had a name now. It had a source. It had a history that connected me to a woman I had never known, who had stood in front of something ancient and terrifying, and had seen clearly enough to be seen in return. Medusa. The word had a different weight now than it had ever had. Not the weight of mythology or court legend or the stories told to children about turning to stone. The weight of a person, a very old person, who had made a specific choice in a specific moment, and was still, somehow, connected to the consequence of that choice. Why me? The question had a partial answer now, but partial answers always carry a larger question inside them, and the one inside this one was enormous. What did she need me to see that she couldn't? I did not sleep that night either. 2 days with almost no sleep. And the sight showing me the room's truth the whole time, the walls with their absorbed histories, the worn places where my mother had stood and cooked and worried. The thin light of early morning finding the book of children's songs back on its shelf, empty of its secret now, just a book. I went to the courthouse. I asked to be registered as a character witness for the trial of Cale, son of Sarah, Archive Section 12. The clerk looked at my name without reaction, which meant Vane had not yet found a way to prevent it, which meant I had surprised him. I had one more day. I needed to use it. What I did not know, standing at that courthouse window with the registration form in my hand, was that Dorian had already spoken to someone that morning, that the conversation he had had before I woke up had been about me. That the sealed thing beneath his warmth had made a specific calculation and arrived at a specific decision. I would not know that for another day. The clock that Ashenmere's new moon was keeping did not care what I didn't know. It kept moving anyway. The trial chamber of the Royal Court of Ashenmere was built for a specific purpose, and that purpose was not justice. It was built for the performance of justice, for the conversion of uncertain outcomes into certain records, for the public witnessing of the mechanism by which the kingdom processed its loose ends. The ceiling was high enough to suggest the gravity of the proceedings without being high enough to feel genuinely vast. The windows let in the right amount of light to see everything while casting just enough shadow to allow for the dignified management of inconvenient expressions. The chairs of the council members were arranged to face the petitioner's position at an angle that made it geometrically impossible to look at more than 2 members at a time. A subtle architecture of authority that meant you were always, in some sense, turning your back on someone important. I knew all of this because my mother had described it to me years ago in one of her rare explanatory moods. When I had asked her what it was like to spend her life working inside the official machinery of a kingdom's truth, she had said, "It is like being a very good clock. You keep correct time. You do not ask what the time is for." I stood in the petitioner's position on the morning of the new moon, with El Haran at my back and my mother's scroll in my hand. And I understood for the first time what it meant to be a clock that had decided to ask. Kale was brought in from the holding cells by 2 guards who treated him with the specific care of people who have been told to keep someone presentable for a public proceeding. He looked thinner than he had when they took him. He looked like someone who had spent 3 days calculating the probability of outcomes and had arrived at a number he could not tell me. When he saw me standing in the petitioner's position, his face did something very small and very specific. Not hope, not surprise, but the recalibration of someone who had stopped calculating hope and suddenly finds they have to start again. I did not smile at him. I looked at him with the sight which showed me what I had already known, that he was innocent. That his involvement had been exactly what I had told Vane, a door left open. A set of courier records accessed without understanding what they were being accessed for. A favor done for someone he trusted, in a moment of casual helpfulness that had been converted into evidence of conspiracy by the simple act of being documented by the right archivist at the right time. That archivist was in the room. I could see him, a man in his 40s, with the particular tension of someone who had been counting on a specific outcome and was now watching the setup shift. The sight showed me his guilt in the same flat, informational way it showed me everything, not as an accusation but as a fact. The same way it might show me that the room was cold or the windows were east-facing. He had filed the document. He had done it under instruction, and he was frightened, and beneath the frightened was the same architecture I had seen in Vane, the same load-bearing acceptance of wrongdoing as a feature rather than a flaw. Councillor Vane was seated at the council table in the 3rd position from the left. He was watching me with the stillness of someone who has prepared for multiple outcomes. His face was giving me nothing. The sight showed me the fear beneath, brighter now, not screaming exactly, but alert. The heightened state of something that senses it may not have prepared correctly. King Aldrich was in his chair on the dais. He was a middle-aged man with the particular look of someone who had inherited rather than earned his authority and had spent decades making peace with the cognitive dissonance of that arrangement. He was not unkind. He was not attentive. He was the kind of man who preferred to have difficult things handled by people he trusted, which meant he had trusted Vane for 20 years, which meant he was complicit in everything Vane had done in the most comfortable possible way, through deliberate incuriosity. The trial began. The Crown's advocate laid out the case against Hale in the practiced rhythm of someone reciting a story they had been given rather than one they had assembled. The evidence was official and documented. The courier access log with my brother's name, the cross-reference to the archive section where the duplicate authorization records were stored, the testimony of the archivist who had filed the accusation. Each element was precise and documented, and with the sight I could see it from the inside, the architecture of a constructed narrative, scaffolded from real facts arranged to tell a false story. The facts were true, the story was not. When it was my turn to speak, I stood up. "My name is Lyra," I said. "My mother was Sarah, archivist to the Royal Archive for 19 years. I am here as a character witness for my brother. I am also here to submit corroborating testimony under the Edict of Clarity, attested by 2 witnesses of recognized standing." The advocate looked surprised. Vane did not. "The first witness is a document, a sealed scroll in my mother's hand, describing the unauthorized duplication of the royal seal 7 years ago, on the instruction of Councillor Aldous Vane, by the senior archivist of that period. The second witness is L. Heron of Archives Section 3, who, in the performance of her duties 7 years ago, identified a fiscal discrepancy connected to this duplication and submitted an annotation that was never addressed." Silence. The particular silence of a room in which the official version of events has just been challenged by something too specific to dismiss. Vane said nothing. He was very still. The fear in the architecture had reached a pitch I could almost hear. And then the compulsion came. Not gradual this time, immediate and total, the way a dam gives way not incrementally, but all at once. The moment the pressure exceeds the structure's capacity. I had come into this room with a plan, say what was needed, provide the corroboration, let the legal mechanism run. But the sight was showing me the room and everyone in it, and the truths it was showing me were not only the ones I had prepared to speak, and the compulsion did not distinguish between the truths I had chosen and the truths I hadn't. I spoke the archivist's name. I spoke the exact nature of his involvement, not vague allegation, but the specific action, the specific date, the specific document. His face collapsed inward, the way things collapse when the internal structure they've depended on is suddenly not there. I spoke Vane's name. I described what I could see in him, not in the language of the site. I had learned enough in 2 days to translate, but in the language of evidence. The account that received the redirected funds, the name it was registered under, the correspondence with a land acquisition outside, Ashonmir's borders that could be found in the cross-reference records if anyone chose to look, which they would now be compelled to. And then I spoke a name I had not planned to speak. One of the junior court scribes was sitting in the recording section, his pen moving across his document in the mechanical way of someone taking down official testimony. He was a young man, not much older than Cale, who had nothing to do with any of this, had come to work that morning, had been assigned to the trial record because his senior had taken ill, had sat down and begun transcribing, because that was his job. But the sight was showing me something in him that had nothing to do with the trial, and the compulsion was in full motion now, and the truth that came out of my mouth was his truth, not Vane's, not the archivist's, a private debt, a borrowed sum, a creditor who was also a court official. A pressure that was being applied to him weekly in ways that had nothing to do with the legal system and everything to do with the unofficial power structures that ran underneath it. He looked up from his transcription. His face went white. I heard myself speaking it, his name, the creditor's name, the exact nature of the pressure, and I also heard myself understanding, in the part of my mind that was still watching what my mouth was doing, that I had just destroyed his privacy in a room full of the most powerful people in Ashtonmere. For no strategic reason, simply because the site had seen it and the compulsion had no filter. The room erupted. Not all at once. First, in the precise, contained way of people who have been trained in public composure, voices carefully modulated, chairs moved back rather than knocked over. Then, as the implications cascaded less carefully, the advocate was on his feet. Vane was on his feet. King Aldrich had leaned forward in his chair with the expression of a man who had just realized he had been doing someone else's seeing for a very long time. The guards moved toward me. Not to take me into custody, not yet, not clearly enough for that. But with the reflex of people who need to be seen to be doing something about a situation that has exceeded the parameters of the situation, Cale's chains were removed. It happened almost as an afterthought, in the chaos, the advocate making the motion automatically, because the evidence against him had just been superseded by the evidence against everyone else in the room. And Ashtonmere's legal mechanism, whatever its limitations, could not charge a man for holding a door open when the people who had asked him to hold it were standing in the same room, being named My brother walked toward me through the chaos. His face was doing something I could not entirely read. Even with the sight, not because the sight couldn't reach it, but because what it showed me was too layered to process quickly. Relief, gratitude, fear for me. And something else, something that had been there since the night he had come home with ink that wasn't his on his collar and gone to bed too early. A knowledge he had been carrying about the favor he'd done and who had asked him to do it, about the door he had held open and who had walked through it. "We need to leave," he said quietly. "Now." Before Vane recalibrates, "The scribe," I said. "I didn't mean to, I know." Kale said, "Come on." We were halfway to the door when I saw Dorian at the back of the room. He was standing very still in the way he had stood in the coffee house, poised, attentive, the easy bearing of someone accustomed to belonging wherever they were. But the sight was showing me something that had not been there before. The sealed thing underneath his warmth was not sealed anymore. The compulsion had pulled something open without my meaning to, not about him, not his truth directly, but the truth of the room had destabilized whatever he had been using to stay sealed. And for one single, irreversible moment, the sight could reach him. What it showed me was not a face. What it showed me was an absence, not the absence of a person. Dorian was a person, warm-blooded and real, and standing 6 feet away from me with something complicated in his expression. But the absence of origin? The absence of the normal architecture of a human life? The layers of formative history? The accumulated small truths of years lived in ordinary time. He was complete on the surface and hollow underneath, in the specific way of something that had been constructed rather than grown. The sight lasted 1 second. Then, the seal came back, complete and impenetrable, and Dorian was simply Dorian again. Warm expression, complicated eyes. A man watching a woman he cared about walk toward him through the wreckage of a trial that had just taken half the court's official reality with it. "You did it," he said. "Yes," I said. "At considerable cost," he said, looking at the room. Looking at the scribe, who was being absorbed by a cluster of concerned colleagues. "Yes," I said. He put his hand on my arm. The warmth of it was real. Everything about him that I had loved for 3 years was real. And beneath all of it, the hollow place that the sight had touched for 1 second pulsed once. Like something alive that had been holding its breath. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Not here. Tonight, will you come and find me tonight?" "Yes," I said. I should not have said yes. I knew, even as I said it, with the same certainty the sight gave me about other people's truths, that yes was the wrong answer. But the compulsion, which had so little regard for strategy, apparently had even less for self-preservation. Outside the courthouse, in the long, flat light of the new moon morning, my brother put his arm around my shoulders and did not say anything for a long time. Then, the man who asked me to access the courier records, it was Dorian Lyra. The words had the specific weight of something I had already known. The sight had known, the sight had been trying, in the 1 second it had been allowed to reach him, to show me what I was walking toward. "He said it was for research," Kale said. "He said he was cross-referencing courier routes for an archive project. He said he seemed to know you. He mentioned you in a way that made me trust him without thinking about it. He is very good at that," I said. I was not crying. I was watching the city move around us, the morning market, the archive clerks on their way to the late session. The coffee house beginning to fill for the afternoon crowd, with the site cataloging all of it in the flat, informational way it always did. Everyone carrying something, everyone performing the version of themselves they had decided to offer the world. I had freed my brother. I had exposed Vane. I had also exposed a young scribe who had nothing to do with any of it, whose privacy I had consumed as collateral, whose face had gone white in a room full of powerful people who now knew things about him he had never consented to have known. That cost lived in my chest alongside the other ones. The sight did not grade costs by intention. It did not distinguish between the damage you meant to do and the damage you did. "Where is Medusa?" I said. I don't know why I asked. I had only felt her once, at the edge of the room, the night before the trial, the specific quality of very ancient attention. But I knew, the way I knew other things through the sight, that she was close, that she had been close since the morning Kale was taken, that she had been watching. Kale looked at me. "What?" "Nothing," I said. "Let's go." We went home. We sat in the kitchen, in the old positions, him at the table, me at the counter, the fire between us, and he told me everything he had not told me before. The small details of a favor given to a charming man who had mentioned his sister with affection, who had seemed to know her well enough to be trusted, and I listened with the sight running the whole time, cataloging my brother's truth with the same flat attentiveness it gave everything. Yes, this happened. Yes, this is real. Yes, he was used and did not know it. Yes, the regret is genuine and structural. Yes, there is no version of this where he is culpable in any meaningful sense. But there is also no version of this where I am not walking into whatever Dorian has planned for tonight. There is no version of this where I do not go. A compulsion does not work that way. The sight does not work that way. And 3 years of loving something, even something that turns out to be partly hollow, does not dissolve in an afternoon. I told Kale I needed an hour alone. He did not argue. He sat with the fire, and I went to my room and I lay on my back on the bed with my eyes open and the sight showing me the ceiling's truth. Plain plaster, decades of small domestic days. My mother's presence in the texture of the room, and I thought about what it meant to see everything clearly and still choose to go toward the thing you could not see. That was the specific grief of the gift. It did not protect you from the choices you were willing to make. It only made sure you made them with your eyes open. Dorian was waiting in the small courtyard garden behind the archive district. The one that public workers used for their midday hour and that emptied by dusk. He was sitting on the low stone bench with his hands resting on his knees and his face turned toward the last of the light. And he looked, in that moment, exactly like himself, the self I had known for 3 years. The self that had carried documents up courthouse steps and offered help without expectation and spoken clearly in a coffee house while something sealed kept its silence underneath. He heard me before he saw me. When he turned, the sight had nothing. Sealed again, complete, impenetrable. Except that now I knew the shape of the seal, and knowing the shape of something is a kind of seeing. "You know," he said. It was not a question. About Kale. Yes, about the rest. I sat down on the bench at the other end from him. "Tell me the rest." He was quiet for a moment. In the dimming courtyard, the first evening birds had started. The archive district was settling into its nighttime quiet. The institutional hum of the day giving way to the particular silence of buildings full of stored truths. "I was sent here," he said, 3 years ago. "Before you, before this." He gestured toward my eyes, toward the thing he could clearly see in them now. The faint green light that I had been told by Kale was visible in certain angles of light, a quality of luminescence that had not been there before. I was sent to find the bloodline, to find the current inheritor of the site, and to evaluate the situation. "Who sent you?" He turned his hands over in his lap. "There is a group. Not large, not young, people who have been aware of what Medusa gave to your bloodline for several generations, who have been tracking the line through the archive records, waiting for the generation that would actually manifest the gift fully. You are the first in 4 generations to have it active." He paused. "They are not kind people. I want you to know that I understood that by the time I understood you, the sight was showing me nothing. The seal held. And yet I believed him, not because the sight confirmed it, but because the part of me that had spent 3 years learning to read him had assembled its own kind of evidence. Slower and less certain than what lay behind my eyes, but not wrong." "What did they send you to do?" "To assess whether the sight was returnable," he said, "whether there was a mechanism for extracting the bloodline gift and transferring it to a controlled subject." The air in the courtyard was cold and very still. "They believe," he continued, "that the gift is not a genetic inheritance, but a deliberate implantation. That Medusa placed it in your ancestor as a key, something that would need to be recovered when the time came. He looked at me. They had been waiting a long time for the lock to appear. What lock? That, he said, is what I don't know, what they haven't told me, what I was supposed to deliver you to find out. The sound of that deliver you had the specific weight of things that are said honestly in order to be taken seriously. He was not pretending this was better than it was. He was telling me exactly what it was, which was the most dangerous possible thing he could have done. And the sight was still sealed, and I was watching him from the bench with the new eyes and the old eyes simultaneously, trying to understand what it meant that both were reaching the same place. "Why are you telling me?" I said. He was quiet for a long moment. In the garden, the evening had completed itself, the last of the light going from gold to gray to the particular dark of a new moon night. "Because I spent 3 years," he said, "watching someone learn to see. And I think that's the only thing I have ever done that I can honestly call an education." I stood up. The sight, which had been running its continuous assessment of the world around me all evening, shifted suddenly, not a new input, but a change in the ambient quality of the air. The specific sensation I had felt twice before and was beginning to recognize as a signature. She was in the courtyard. Not manifested, not visible the way a person is visible, but present in the way that very old things are present, as a weight in the texture of the space. A quality of attention that predated the buildings and the archive and the edict carved in the stones and the 400 years of Ashenmir's accumulated official version of events. "Medusa, you should go," I said to Dorian. He looked at me. Then he looked at the empty air of the courtyard with the expression of someone who can feel a presence without being able to see it, which was the correct instinct. "Will you be all right?" "Go," I said. "And tell the people who sent you that the lock and the key are not what they think they are." He stood. He put his hand on my arm for a moment, that same gesture from the courthouse, warm and deliberate. Then he walked out of the courtyard without looking back, which was the bravest thing he had done in the 3 years I had known him. And I watched him go with all the eyes I had, and the sight, for the last time, slid cleanly off the sealed thing beneath his warmth without giving me its truth. Some things are not for seeing. That was what I was beginning to learn. The presence in the courtyard deepened. Not dramatic, no light, no sound, no transformation. Simply the increasing certainty that I was no longer alone in the way I had been alone. That the weight of attention that had been watching me from the edges for a week had decided, finally, to come closer. I turned around. She was standing at the far end of the garden, near the old stone wall where the archive district ended and the older part of the city began. She looked. I had not known what I expected, having spent my life with the mythology and the legend and the stories told to children, which described her in terms of horror and power and the terrible beauty of destruction. What she looked like was tired and very old. Not in her face, which was ageless in the way of something that stopped counting a long time ago. In her eyes, in the particular quality of her gaze, which had seen so many things that the seeing itself had become the thing she carried. The serpents in her hair moved with the slow, organic calm of things that had long since given up performing for an audience. "You did well," she said. "I exposed a scribe," I said. "Someone who had nothing to do with any of it." "Yes," she said. "You did that too." The sight, running its continuous assessment, reached toward her and did something it had done with nothing and no one else. It went quiet, not sealed, like Dorian. Not absent, like a wall. Quiet in the way of something that was to fully, completely, impossibly itself, to be translated by a gift that worked by finding the hidden version underneath the presented one. There was no hidden version. There was only her. All the way down, layer after layer, of the same truth in the same voice. "Why me?" I said. It was not the first time I had asked the question, but it was the first time I had asked it to the right person, because your mother's blood carried the site for 4 generations without manifesting it, she said, and then you were born and you saw me in a way no one has seen me in a very long time. Not with fear, not with the projected story, with your own eyes. You were 3 years old. You were in the archive with your mother, and I was passing through the restricted section where they keep the oldest records, the ones from before the kingdom had a name. You looked up and you looked at me and you didn't look away. I thought about being 3 years old. I thought about the quality of a child's sight before the world teaches it to be afraid. I didn't know it was you, I said. No, she said. You just saw someone who looked tired and gave her the look a person gives someone who is tired. Which is, for the record, a form of recognition that is rarer than any gift I have ever given. The night had settled completely around us. The courtyard was very dark and very quiet. The people who want to find the lock, I said. What do they think it is? They think it is a door, she said. A door into something I sealed centuries ago that they believe contains power they could use. She was quiet for a moment. The serpents moved. They are not entirely wrong about the door. They are entirely wrong about what is behind it. What is behind it? She looked at me with those very old eyes that the sight had no language for. The memory, she said, of what I was before I was made into what I am. The history of something that was turned into a story and then into a legend and then into a warning, and lost the thing it started as somewhere in the conversion. She paused. The lock is not a door into power. It is a door into my original face. The one that existed before the world decided what face I should have. I understood, without being told, that this was what she had not been able to see. Not the lock itself. She had made the lock. She knew where it was, but what was behind it, what the door, if opened, would show her. You cannot see your own original face. You can only give someone else the eyes that might be able to reach it. You want me to open it? I said. I want you to choose, she said. That is the only thing I have ever wanted from anyone. The sight was running very quietly now, like a river in its deepest channel. I could feel it touching the edge of something enormous, not frightening, not destabilizing, but vast in the way that things are vast when you are finally standing close enough to see their actual size. What happens to me if I do? You will see something no one has ever seen, she said, and you will lose the sight that let you see it. The gift does not survive being fully used. That was always the condition, even before your ancestor agreed to it. The things that let you see clearly can only carry so much clarity before they are spent. She looked at me with the directness of someone who has been honest about difficult things for a very long time. Your brother will be safe. The charges are dissolved. Vane is finished. What happens to you after is your own life returned to you with ordinary eyes. I thought about what ordinary eyes had cost me. The years of social inference, the slow guesswork, the invisibility that came with being a person the world had decided not to inform. I thought about the scribe in the courthouse and his white face and the spiced knowledge I had not consented to carry and then could not stop from speaking. I thought about Dorian and the 3 years and the hollow place the sight had touched for 1 second and could not name. And your original face, I said, if I see it, if I open the door, what does that change? She was quiet for a long time. When she spoke, her voice had a different quality, not softer exactly, but less defended. Something that had been held at a specific angle for centuries, shifted slightly. It changes what the story is, she said, not the history. The history is what it is, but what the story tells, going forward. What is remembered, what the memory holds. She looked at the old stone wall at the archive district. At the building where records were stored and maintained and occasionally revised. I have been a warning long enough. I would like, before this particular era ends, to be seen as something else. Even by one person. Even once, I sat in the dark courtyard of the archive district of Ashenmere on the night of the new moon, with my brother safe and Vane finished and the site running its last quiet river. And I thought about my mother writing in her small, steady handwriting. You carry that clarity. Be careful with it. It costs more than you know. She had been right, and she had also been wrong, in the way that parents are wrong about the specific shapes of cost. It did not cost what she had expected. It cost what it cost, which was its own thing, which was the cost of using your own eyes in a world that prefers you don't. Yes, I said. It was not dramatic, not a ritual, not a ceremony, not a spectacle. I looked at her the way I had looked at her when I was 3 years old, with my own eyes. No projection, no story overlaid on the sight, and the gift opened. Fully and completely, the way it had been waiting to from the moment it woke up, and I saw what she had been before the world decided what she was. I cannot tell you what it was. Not because it is unspeakable, because it is mine and hers, and that is the only kind of private thing the sight had ever found that I was willing to keep. When it was over, the sight was gone, not taken, finished. Used completely, spent, the river emptied to its last clear drop. The courtyard was dark and quiet, and I could see only what ordinary eyes see, which is to say I could see almost nothing at all, which was also a kind of clarity in its own way. She was still there. For a moment longer, then she was not. I sat in the empty courtyard for a long time. Around me, the archive district breathed its institutional breath, the buildings full of records. The official version of everything, the documents that constituted Sean Mears' idea of what was true. Somewhere in a cell that no longer held him, my brother's chains were already being filed as dissolved. Somewhere in the city, Councillor Vane was calculating what came next, with less certainty than he had ever calculated anything. Somewhere beyond the city's border, and this was the last thing the site had shown me before it went. A gift wrapped in the gift, an inheritance inside the inheritance. There were people moving. The people who had sent Dorian, moving toward the city, toward the bloodline, toward the key they believed, they understood. They were not close yet, but they were not distant. I went home. Cale was still sitting with the fire. He looked up when I came in. You went to see him? He said yes. And I sat down across from him. The fire was low, but still present, the specific warmth of something not yet finished. Dorian was sent to find me, I said. There is a group that wants access to something Medusa sealed centuries ago. They think it's power. They were going to use me to find it. I paused. They're still out there, coming. Cale looked at me for a long moment. And the sight, gone, I said. He did not say anything immediately. We sat with the fire the way we had sat with fires since we were children, in the chairs that were our chairs, in the positions that were our positions. In the house our mother had filled with her own particular quality of paying attention to things. What did you see? He said finally, at the end. I thought about my mother's scroll. I thought about the Edict of Clarity, and the stones everyone walked over, and the archive buildings full of the official version of everything, and the specific, exhausted dignity of someone who had been a warning long enough, and the feeling of being seen by something very old that was grateful. Simply and profoundly grateful, to be recognized without its story, something that deserved to be seen, I said. The fire crackled. Outside, the new moon night was complete, dark, and cool, and enormous. The way nights are when you are using ordinary eyes again, and the world has returned to its usual density of mystery. Cale put another log on the fire. It caught quickly, the way dry things catch when they're ready. The room filled with warm light that showed us exactly what was there. 2 people at the end of a long week. A house that held the memory of their mother. A window that looked out on a city that was, even now, quietly beginning to process the end of a version of itself. And beyond the border, moving, patient, certain they understood what they were looking for, the ones who were coming, I was not afraid of them. I had used my last clear sight, and I knew, as certainly as I had known anything in the days when the sight was mine, that they would not find what they expected. That the lock and the key were not what they believed, that the door they wanted to open had already been opened by someone they had never thought to look for in a dark courtyard on a new moon night. in the archive district of Ashanmir, because a 3-year-old had once looked up at something frightening and chosen not to look away. What Medusa could not see was what I had seen. And what I had seen was hers now, held in the only archive that can hold it. The memory of someone who was there. She believed those people at the border were the only threat that remained. She was wrong. The sealed thing beneath Dorian's warmth had a name that neither of us had spoken. That name was a door. And doors, once noticed, have a way of opening whether or not you are ready for what stands on the other side. If this story reached your heart, leave us a like and share it. What would you have done? And don't miss what comes next, another memory Medusa never forgot.